Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 PIBBSS Symposium. Now we have Antoine talking about discovery and refinement of mechanisms in parameter space of neural networks. Go ahead, Antoine, and if people have more questions, they can talk to the speaker in the breakout room after the talk. Go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, welcome to this presentation. Yes, I'm going to talk about mechanistic interpretability because I've been learning this field over the summer, and in particular a new alley in mechanistic interpretability that is called parameter space decomposition, where the goal is basically to decompose neural networks into all the mechanisms they contain in the same way you would investigate how bacteria works by decomposing into mechanisms. So the aim is to do the same thing on large neural networks. And I want to contextualize it. I think it's important to, when we do mechanistic interpretability, is like this entirely new field of scientific inquiry that people have been building from scratch in the last 3 or 4 years. And it kind of sounds like people are telling you, hey, come to California, we are building this new scientific field. There are no rules, no paradigm, everything has yet to be defined. You can just come up with entirely new objects, so it's very exciting for any scientist. But it's important to keep in mind what is the actual purpose of this, what is like the big project of mechanistic interpretability, and whether what we are doing is realistic and actually has a chance to succeed. So for context, well, this is 2025. It feels like a very pivotal year for the prospect of understanding what neural networks do. Some things that happened this year where we have 3 different AI models that claim they can get a gold medal at the International Math Olympiad. So presumably AI model can now do math much better than I can. And we don't know how they do that. There is some research about how neural networks are able to do math. For instance, also from this year, there was this very nice paper explaining how language models perform addition. So it was really cool study. They found that the numbers, the integers, are stored on this helical structure, and so it's using trigonometry to compute addition. So this was on a 6 billion parameters model from 2021. So something super small and super obsolete compared to the kind of models that actually win gold medals. And we don't actually know if any of that applies to these larger models, but we can say that at least we have a rough sense of how these models perform addition. Regarding multiplication, this is still largely a mystery. Like, there are some studies, but we mostly, as far as I know, don't understand how to do multiplication. So just to be sure, I asked Claude to one-shot the solve a first-order linear equation without chain of thought, and it could come up with the correct answer. And I think people, especially in the broader general public, don't appreciate to what extent we just have no idea how this works. Like, we don't know how Claude is able to solve this kind of equation. And that's pretty concerning because we have this very large technology that does a lot of amazing things, but we already don't know how it works. So that's where the field of mechanistic interpretability comes into play. And so the goal is to try to understand how these models work. And I'll start with the bad news. The first thing is that the frontier neural networks are very large. And I put large in italic because I really mean large. And I think it's underappreciated just how large they are compared to other objects, other complicated systems humans have studied in science before. I like to I like to give a sense of scale. I like to use the information content of the genome of living organisms. So for instance, E. coli, the bacterium that we know the best, that has been studied as a model organism for a century or so. It has a genome of roughly 5 million nucleotides, which can be compressed into 1.3 megabytes. So that is small enough to fit on a floppy disk. It's just pretty insane how compressed and how simple these bacteria are. And at this point, after a century of research, there are maybe 15% of the genes that we don't know what they do at all. Like we don't have any idea of what effects they have on the phenotype of the organism. Then you can scale this up by 1,000-fold and get humans. So humans are clearly more complex than bacteria. The genome, if you take the useful fraction of the genome, you can compress it to 1.6 gigabytes, which is, I believe, is something like a DVD. And that contains all the 25,000 genes of the human genome, so all the regulatory pathway or the genetic switches that turn a single cell into a fully functional human body are contained in this genome. And it might seem like humans are complicated, like they have a lot of mechanisms, but compared to frontier language models that we have currently, they are a few orders of magnitude more simple. If you take DeepSeek R1, for instance, the weights take about 700 gigabytes, so it's like more than 100 times larger in terms of information content than the human genome. So if we actually want to understand all the mechanisms in DeepSeek R1, it's pretty safe to argue that this is going to be, by a few orders of magnitude, the most complicated system ever studied by humans. So this is a pretty unprecedented challenge. And so it's important to keep in mind just how difficult this is going to be. And to make things worse, models are changing all the time. So it's a very common pattern in mechanistic interpretability is that we have research on super obsolete models. So there's like a lot of research on GPT-2, but nobody uses these models anymore. And it's not just that the models are getting obsolete, it's also that the architectures are getting obsolete. So if we develop techniques to understand how transformers work, that could be very useful as long as we keep using transformers. But eventually, maybe someone will come up with a new architecture, and then it's pretty unclear whether all the work we've done developing transformer-specific techniques is going to be worth anything at all. So this is the bad news. On the other hand, this means we will have to dramatically scale up the scientific method if we want to have any hope of being able to predict and control the behavior of large language models by inspecting their internals and by understanding how they work. Here are some good news. Obviously, if I'm going to compare mechanistic interpretability with biology, then I need to be fair. The experiments are much easier in mechanistic interpretability. So there's this thing where you can just write a line of code and press enter, and then you get the value of a weight in the neural network. Obviously, doing that for bacteria, if you wanted to know the strength of interaction between two proteins, you need like a $200,000 microscope and six months of work from a PhD student. So this is just like a lot of MakeInterp is just making scripts that automatically iterate on experiments, and you can run them overnight, and it's going to do like a PhD worth of experiments every minute. So that's clearly really nice. But I think the underrated aspect of MakeInterp that doesn't apply to biology is that we have access to the original training data. And that's pretty crucial because in biology, a core limitation of biology is that we don't know what the organisms have been selected for in the first place by evolution. Like we don't have a history of all the environments that have exerted selective pressure on living organisms so far. So we have to kind of speculate about what they do. But in the case of neural network, we can actually replace the entire training. We know exactly what they've been trained to predict. And as we'll see, this allows us to define mechanisms in a more rigorous way or in a more principled way that would be possible for biology. And so that's going to be very important. So I don't know if there's any questions so far. So I'm going to go through the basics of how parameter space decomposition works, meaning how do we define mechanisms, like what information do we use to discover the mechanisms, and just how the entire conceptual framework works. And it starts by, so what we need is a scalable definition of mechanisms. We need a way to identify a mechanism in a system that is way too big to be inspected manually. So we want something that will allow to discover mechanisms automatically. So how can we break down a neural network into all the mechanisms it contains? So traditionally, the classic informal definition of a mechanism that is usually used in biology is to define it in relation to a task. So for example, if you have purple bacteria, you want to know why they are purple, or how do they produce a purple pigment. You could typically try to remove all the genes in the genome one by one. And then sometimes you find that when you remove a gene, the bacteria is no longer purple. So you do that on all the genes, and eventually you have a list of all the genes that make the bacteria no longer purple. And then you can take these genes and say, yes, this is the mechanism that make purple pigment. Then there's some refinement possible. You could take these genes, put them in another species, check that they become purple, or maybe purify the proteins and see if you can in vitro make purple pigment. And all of that will confirm that you've identified the correct mechanism. But the starting point is really to find what parts of the organism are responsible for carrying out a task. And people have done very similar things at the beginning in neural network. This is just one example, like the GPT-2 predicting a number that is greater than the previous number. You ask it something like the world lasted from the year 1732 to the year 17, and it's able to give you a number that is higher. So that makes sense, like chronologically. So people have identified this capability of GPT-2 and then figured out how it does it, pinpointed the mechanism. But this definition of mechanism is not scalable at all because it requires noticing the capability of your system. So you need to know what the task is in order to find the mechanism that does this task. But obviously we don't have a list of all the tasks, all the elementary tasks neural network can perform. So that's not going to work. However, we have access to the full training data, and as I said, it's going to change everything because we can now define mechanisms based on their activity patterns. So what do I mean by an activity pattern? I mean that if you break down your system into tiny elementary parts, the activity pattern is in what part of the training data, in what situations is this part necessary, or in what situations does this part have an effect on the outcome. So to take an example, a concrete example, imagine you want to decompose a bicycle into mechanism. So what you could do is look at throughout the life cycle of the bicycle, what are all the situations that ever involve the bicycle, and check for each of the situations. For each situations, you can remove various parts of the bicycle and see whether it affects the behavior or not. So for instance, if you're going downhill, maybe you're not pedaling because you're going downhill, you're going straight, so you're not using this part of the steering wheel. So these two parts can be removed and it's not going to change anything to the behavior of the bicycle. Now later you are going uphill and that changes the which parts are active or not. Now, so this time you are pedaling, so you can no longer remove the pedals. However, you can remove the brakes because you don't need to brake when you are going uphill. So you could basically take go iterate over all the situations a bicycle ever finds itself into, and for each of the situations, make a list of all the elementary parts of the bicycle that matter for the situation. And now the definition of mechanisms we have is if two elementary parts of the bicycle are active in the same subset of environments, and we group them in the same mechanism. So you could say like all the atoms of the bike that are involved in some very specific pattern corresponding to whenever you need to brake. This will give you like the part of the bicycle that is responsible for braking. So the correct assumption is basically that each situation will require a unique subset of tasks. And so you are basically grouping the mechanisms by the task that they perform without actually knowing what the tasks are. Like this is still undefined. And this is what makes this definition of mechanism more scalable and more amenable to be applied to large language models. So how to do that for large language models in practice? So we have two prerequisites. First, we need to define core elementary building blocks, because the goal is going to be to ablate some parts of the system and see if they matter or not. So we need a definition for how do we split the system into blocks as finely as possible. And then we need to think about what it means to ablate a building block. Like how do you remove something from a neural network to see if it matters? What does it even mean to take a part out? So first, what are we going to use as elementary building blocks? And in parameter space decomposition, the elementary block is a rank 1 matrix. So that's the technical term is subcomponent. So a rank 1 matrix. Any matrix can be written as a sum of rank 1 matrices. So that's suitable for decomposing a network. You could take all the matrices in the network and decompose them as a sum of rank 1 matrices, and each rank 1 matrix is the outer product of two vectors. So I call them V out and V in. So that's going to be our elementary building block. And the reason why we pick this particular mathematical object is that because it has a lot of nice properties that makes it a very good way to represent mechanisms and also to represent the entire network. So if you put a rank 1 matrix in a neural network, what does it do? Essentially, what it does is detect a feature in the previous layer by taking the dot product between the activations and the V-in write vector, and then write to the next layer accordingly in the V-out direction. So essentially what it's doing is detecting a feature and writing another feature in response. And this is actually very expressive. If you think about the mechanisms of the behavior of transformers we know about so far, a lot of them can simply be written with very few rank 1 matrices. Like if you think about the attention patterns in transformers or the memory lookup mechanisms in perceptrons. So there's everything that just involves detecting features and writing other features can be written with just a few rank 1 matrices, and then we can combine them to build higher rank mechanisms. And this is where it gets interesting, because we can represent mechanisms that couldn't be represented with traditional activation space interpretability, for instance, like sparse autoencoders or transcoders. They cannot account for mechanisms that involve sharing or rotation or identities, any higher rank mechanism. But if you're trying to describe mechanisms in terms of rank 1 matrices, you can simply build any higher rank transformation you like by just stacking a few rank 1 matrices together, like a 2D rotation to represent the time of the day is something you could very easily write as 2 rank 1 matrices. On the other hand, they are also very restricted, which is a good thing, because we want mechanisms that we can interpret. We want to be able to make claims about what the mechanism can do and cannot do. So we want mathematical boundaries to the possible behavior of a mechanism. And rank 1 matrices are very restricted. They can only read from one direction and write in another direction, and it's never going to output any other direction, no matter what you do, which gives us a way to make claims about what the network is doing that might be very useful for safety application. So that's how we are going to represent our mechanisms. And now we can think about what it means to ablate a rank 1 matrix out of a network. So remember, these rank 1 components we are building, they are going to add up to the original weights of the network. So you can simply just remove them from the stack and calculate the new values without the component you want to ablate. And this is going to give you a new network with the candidate components removed, and you can run it and see if the output are changing or not, which tells you whether the mechanism is active or not. So in practice, when is that possible? And there are essentially 2 cases. The first case is when the input feature that the rank 1 mechanism recognizes is absent from the previous layer. So the dot product of begin and x is 0. In that case, the output of this component will always be 0. So you can always ablate it as much as you want. The second case is when maybe the v-in times x is not 0, but then the change in the v-out direction, so the output feature has no downstream effect. This could happen for a variety of reasons. We don't really know in what ways it could happen, but some maybe obvious situations would be when there's a nonlinearity that absorbs the changes in v-out, at least in the range of the training data. So this means that removing the component will not change the output because the effect of the component is completely absorbed. Another case would be an attention mechanism. So in attention heads, you have these key and query matrices that all each generate one feature, and then they kind of recognize each other to form the attention pattern. Now, if the key doesn't generate a feature, then it doesn't really matter whether the query matrix generates the same feature or not, because there's nothing to be recognized. So that could be a case where we can ablate a component in attention heads. And you could think of other situations. So, but yeah, basically these 2 are going to be the 2 situations that make it possible to ablate a component from a neural network. So let's look at a concrete example, just to see how, in a very simple case, like a super tiny toy model called the toy model of superposition, but it has become a classic model organism for mechanistic interpretability, because it illustrates a lot of the key concepts of parameter decomposition quite well. So what this model does is that it has 5 input dimensions, and it projects the input on a 2D hidden layer. So there's some compression that occurs. So each of the 1 hot possible input gets projected to some specific features, and you'll notice that these 5 features are arranged as a pentagon on the 2D plane. And then the second matrix projects this hidden feature back to the 5D space. And since they are not orthogonal, there is some interference between them. So we don't get exactly the original input. What we get is also get these blue values that are negative values. And this is interference between the different components. However, there is then a redo activation that erases all the negative values. So you get this at the end. You remove all the blue values, and you get this output that is very similar to the input. And this model is trained to reconstruct its input. So it's basically an autoencoder. It's just taking 1 hot or sparse inputs and outputting the same thing as a result. So what are the mechanisms according to the definition I just went through? So we can go matrix by matrix. First matrix, if you look at the encoder that maps the 5D input space to the 2D hidden space, we can notice that the inputs are orthogonal. So that means that they don't interfere with each other, and therefore we can define perfect rank 1 components that simply map each of the 1 hot inputs to their corresponding hidden representation. And since these are orthogonal, ablating as an inactive components is not going to do anything. So we will be able to ablate the inactive components, so we can just define the mechanism this way. For the decoder matrix, this is more complicated because this time the hidden features are not orthogonal, so they interfere with each other. But again, all the interference is completely absorbed by the ReLU. So we are in the second case where ablation is possible, the case where changing the output, the pre-ReLU output in the VOUT direction of the matrix has no effect on the final output. And so it's still possible to ablate the inactive components. So we are it's going to be basically the same mechanism, but in reverse, just mapping the hidden mechanism to their post-ReLU output. And this is how we're going to decompose the second matrix. So taken all together, for the toy model of superposition, the ground truth mechanisms are these 5 mechanisms. Each of them is in charge of processing 1 input dimension. And so it generates 1 input, 1 hidden feature, and then brings it back to the original. So we get 5 of them. So this is just like how we define the mechanism. Now I will briefly go over how we discover the mechanism, because it's not enough to just define them. We need an algorithm. We need a way to start from a neural network and obtain the mechanisms. And the way we do that, it's probably going to change a lot because people are developing the technique as we speak. Like it's changing very fast. But just as a course idea, we are using gradient descent. We are basically wishing the solution into existence. So you just initialize a certain number of rank 1 components with random values for each matrix, and then you train the values in these rank 1 components until they satisfy all the criteria we've set as our definition of a mechanism. So this is done with 3 losses. We need to optimize to 3 losses at the same time. Each of them has some coefficients that allows you to tune its intensity. The first loss is a weight faithfulness. It makes sure that the components add up to the original weight. So it makes sure that if all the mechanisms are active, you get the original network, which is kind of important. That's good. That's what anchors the decomposition to the original model. And the second loss is a reconstruction loss. And this implements the fact that we want to be able to remove inactive components, and if they are inactive, they shouldn't, removing them shouldn't change the output of the model. And to be able to do that, we need to know which components are active or inactive. And this is done by adding, for each subcomponent, we have a tiny embedded multi-layer perceptron that keeps track of which mechanism is active or not. So it uses the previous layer's activation to predict is my mechanism active or not. And then if it says it's inactive, then it's the component is going to be randomly ablated, and the ablated model is run on the same input, and we compare the output with the original model, and the reconstruction loss just looks at whether these two inputs are the same. So are we actually trying to ablate, are the components we are trying to ablate actually inactive? And third, we have a third loss called the minimality loss, or importance minimality loss, which tells these multi-layer perceptrons to label mechanisms as active as rarely as possible. So essentially what this is saying is that we want to find the minimal possible description of the model's behavior. Like we want to find the minimal set of mechanisms that faithfully recreate the model's behavior. And so that means that we are trying to ablate on any given input as many mechanisms as we can. And somehow, I mean, this sounds very complicated, but gradient descent is very powerful and kind of magical. So somehow this works. If you run it on the time model of superposition, it converges usually to these mechanisms. Some very important point is that the minimality loss is actually kind of different in nature to the other two losses. It's more instrumental, while the faithfulness and reconstruction loss are more the strict definition of the mechanism. So these define what is a good mechanism. So we want them to be perfectly satisfied as much as practically possible, while we are not actually imposing any minimality in the sense that we are not saying we want the mechanisms to be simple. We don't know if the mechanisms are simple or not. This is a property of the model, not something we get to choose. But we just try to ablate as much as possible to the extent that it doesn't distort the other losses. So I tried very hard to come up with a good analogy for that, and I couldn't, so I came up with a bad analogy instead, and it's like kind of like making churros. You have this part of the churros making machine. This is in my analogy, this is the faithfulness and reconstruction loss. This is the one that actually determines the shape of the end product of the subcomponents, while the minimality loss is more like this piston you use to push the dough through this shape. In itself, the minimality loss is not supposed to contribute to defining the shape of the thing, but it's still necessary to have it, because if you didn't have the minimality loss, you could very easily satisfy these two losses just by keeping the original model intact, which is a way to say the original model is just one big mechanism, and that's technically, philosophically valid, I guess. You can just say, yeah, this is one mechanism, but it's not useful. So we are trying to actually break it down as much as we can. In practice, unfortunately, the minimality loss coefficient does affect the end result. These are activation patterns. So you have vertically, you have the 5 input features of the toy model of superposition, and these are 20 components. So we just provide the decomposition model with 20 components that it can use. It doesn't have to use all of them. In fact, it uses only 5 of them. And this is the correct decomposition, where you have one component per input feature, and each of them is active only once. This is correct, but if the minimality coefficient is too low, then you don't actually reach that result. You instead you fail to find a truly minimalistic descriptions, especially in the second matrix. They have a lot of components that are active, like this input features is using two components at the same time. And so it's not fully decomposing the model, and that's because it doesn't really have to, because the minimality coefficient isn't high enough to actually push it through, to actually shape the component. On the other hand, if the minimality coefficient is too high, you start getting this thing where sometimes a component will completely disappear, because this prevents the model from reconstructing the output accurately. But here the minimality loss is so high that it's worth it. It's worth sacrificing some accuracy if it allows you to ablate more components. And if you look carefully, some of these components have an activation level that is somewhere in between 0 and 1. So it's not like they're active or not active, they're somewhere in between. And the model is kind of cheating by setting it to an intermediate position. So just some kind of awkward trade-off between the different losses. So for correct decomposition, you need to tune the minimality coefficient so it matches, roughly speaking, the actual intrinsic minimality of the mechanism. So that was basically an overview of how parameter space decomposition works. So this was just introduced pretty recently by people from Apollo and now Goodfire. And you can see it as some kind of new conceptual framework for interpretability. So there are a lot of things to explore and a lot of open questions. But let me briefly talk about the possible application. So let's say we can actually decompose large language models into mechanisms using the criteria I just defined. What is it good for? What can we do with it? And so now that we have a clear idea of what the mechanisms are and what are their properties, we can get a more accurate idea of whether this will be possible or not. One thing that is very promising, I think, is to locate knowledge inside neural networks. So for instance, Claude knows that Michael Jordan plays basketball. If you ask it, it knows. So the information has to be somewhere in the network. And there's good hope that if you can run the decomposition on this model, there should be a way to pinpoint which components are in charge of storing that information. So it's not clear if it's going to be very diffuse or if it's going to be just one rank 1 matrix that connects like Michael Jordan to basketball. But the hope is that we can find where the knowledge is located. And then that gives you, maybe you can develop a way to know which pieces of knowledge about the world your model is using at any given time, which is certainly very useful for safety, because you know whether for biosafety, for instance, you can tell whether the model is using its knowledge about viruses or about synthetic biology. So that could be a reasonably good warning shot. And further, there's also hope that we can actually remove undesirable mechanism, because remember, we are breaking down the network into rank 1 matrices that add up to the original weights. So it's possible to just remove these rank 1 matrices, and we know when they are active or not, and we can remove them when they are inactive. So you can just straight up remove the things you don't want, remove the knowledge you want the network to forget, and presumably not affect the performance on any other input. So you can just remove some capabilities while leaving everything else unchanged, which would be really good if we could do that. But this is mostly speculation. I think concretely right now, one thing we can say, what makes parameter space decomposition uniquely appealing to me is that it's just a very precise description of what the model is doing, like the mechanisms are defined in a mathematically precise way. And so it makes further experimentation more tractable. Like when you have the V in and V out vectors of each component, you can make clear claims about what should happen and how they talk to each other, whether the V out of one component feeds information to the V in of a later component. So whenever you observe a neural network doing something strange, it should be much easier to investigate what's going on because it narrows down the set of possible hypotheses quite a lot. Okay, so I don't know if there's any question on that part. So now I'm going to show some results from experiment I've done with this model. So this is mostly things that I've done, like playing around with decompositions to try to make sure that I understand it well and to try to find how the different losses trade off with each other. And first, here is a tricky toy model that is surprisingly difficult to decompose using the default normal parameter decomposition algorithm. It's called the toy model of circuit superposition. It's from a paper by Brian Chrisman. And the structure is the same as the TMS. Again, you have an input layer. This one has 10 dimensions, and it gets projected to a smaller layer with only 5 dimensions, and then expanded back to the original dimensionality. And like in the TMS, we have sparse input, and these sparse inputs are encoded in the hidden layer as lower dimensional features. The difference with the TMS is that this time, instead of trying to reconstruct the inputs, we are asking the model to construct arbitrary fixed features, one different fixed vector for each possible input. So the hidden layer gets expanded as these random arbitrary vectors. And all the values are positive, which means that the final value is never used. This is basically a linear network. And this one, so we can think what are the ground truth subcomponents, like how should we decompose this model? So again, it's just like the TMS for the first matrix. These input features form an orthonormal basis, like they're all orthogonal, so it should be possible to just make subcomponents that map the one hot features to their hidden representation, and they're all going to be it's going to be possible to ablate them in isolation without interference. But for the second matrix, things are pretty different. This time, so since there's no non-linearity, there's no way to erase or cancel out with the interference. And also these hidden representations are not orthogonal, so there's a lot of interference. And this means that we can never ablate any component at all, because anything you change in the second matrix is going to change the output, so there's just no way to ablate anything. Everything is active at the same time. So the correct decomposition in that case would be just one big matrix that corresponds to the full networks matrix. We are basically not decomposing it at all. In practice, since it's a 10x5 matrix, it's at most rank 5, so it should be possible to write it down as the sum of 5 rank 1 subcomponents. So that's what we're going to aim for. The first matrix should be just a diagonal of sparsely activating components with only one active per input. And the second matrix should be 5 components that add up to the original weights and that are basically active on every input. Unfortunately, when I tried to decompose this model using the SPD algorithm, I couldn't find the right solution, or it was extremely difficult. And that's because for any value of the minimality coefficient, either you get partial decomposition in the first matrix. So like in this case, it's not completely decomposed. You still have 2 components active at the same time for the same input. And in that case, you get somewhat good decomposition of the second matrix. So there are 5 components that are ever active in total, and they recreate the rank 5 decoder matrix. But if you increase the minimality coefficient, then you get closer to the right decomposition for the first matrix, but you are also butchering the second matrix at the same time. So it's like for the first matrix, the optimal minimality coefficient should be maybe somewhere in between these two, like high enough that we don't get two components used in the same input, but low enough that we don't start to lose subcomponents entirely. But for the second matrix, the optimal value is probably somewhere here. Like it should be less. This is already too sparse, and at high values, it gets completely broken down. You only have 4 components active at the same time, and they're active at some awkward intermediate level. So everything is trading off with each other. So it's pretty bad. And there's basically no sweet spot where both of the matrices can be accurately decomposed at the same time. And fundamentally, this is because these two mechanisms, these two matrices, have a different intrinsic level of simplicity. This one can be decomposed much further than this one. So there's no way to handle them perfectly at the same time. So a solution I've been experimenting with is to separate the component discovery phase from the component refinement phase. So basically, 2-stage decomposition, I start with a very strong minimality constraint, and then throughout the training, I gradually release this constraint. So to come back to the churros analogy, it's like we are forcing the components to be sparse at the beginning, and this leads to the correct solution for the first matrix, while also butchering the second matrix. But then once we have identified these correct components for the first matrix, we can release the minimality constraint as much as we want, because these components are already faithfully explaining the model, like they're already giving perfect results. So there's no reason for the decomposition model to try to use more components. So as you release it, you can release it to extremely low values, and these components just remain stable. In the meantime, for the second matrix, as you release the minimality constraints, then it starts using more and more components, and eventually you reach a point where it just it has 5 components that it tries to activate all the time. So it never quite get to that point exactly, but it gets much closer to the correct solution. How much time do I have? Okay, 10 minutes. Wait. Yes. So, and if you look at the faithfulness and the reconstruction loss as you release a minimality constraint, they both go down by a lot, by a few orders of magnitude. So releasing this minimality constraint allows to find more accurate components. They are like if you allow the components to like they're getting at the beginning, they're getting distorted by the minimality pressure. So if you release it, they can expand back to their natural form and faithfully reconstruct the outputs of the network, and you get very close to the real behavior of the network. So that could be potentially a way to simplify hyperparameter tuning and also improve decomposition in the process. So the broad idea would be to just start with high minimality coefficients and gradually release it, and then each matrix will expand back to the suitable level, so you don't have to manually tune the amount of minimality you expect. And there are probably fancier versions of that you could come up with, maybe some dynamic adaptive ways to tune this parameter as the decomposition goes through, maybe use a different minimality pressure for each matrix. And another way to think of it would be more like quality control. So it's like here, for the first matrix, the decomposition is perfect. So releasing the importance minimality doesn't change the mechanism, which indicates that these mechanisms are good and they're real mechanisms. But for the second matrix, naively, if you didn't know what the model was doing, you could think, okay, these are the correct mechanisms. But the fact that they change so much as you release the importance minimality coefficient shows you that they don't correspond to something real. They're like real trade-off between different losses, but the behavior of the model is not that simple. So I think there are a lot of things to be explored along that line. Then I think I will just skip over this part because it's complicated and I'm not very confident about it. I think it's very preliminary. So yeah, that brings me to the thank you slide. So yeah, that was the talk. So thank you, of course, to Logan, my mentor, to the various people who provided helpful discussions and feedback, and my PIBBSS fellow for general fund during summer. And I also want to thank the mock staff and custodians. I think they come during the night to clean the office, and I haven't really seen them, but I'm grateful for their work. And yes, that is it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any question.
Yeah, I think Carlo, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so when you sweep over the minimality coefficient, is there like an automated way to determine what that coefficient should be after you've done the sweep?
So you're talking about the release like this one?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about the naive way where we just try different coefficients and find the right one?
Yeah, so this would be like the simplest case.
Yeah, so I mean, to my knowledge, nobody has looked for a systematic way to do that yet. Now it's just done manually. So gradually releasing the minimality coefficients throughout training would be a way so that to make sure you don't have to do that, because I mean, I haven't actually checked that it works, but presumably it would improve the range of coefficients you can use, because the correctly decomposed mechanisms matrices would just stay in the correctly decomposed state. Then yeah, I don't think there have been a lot of work on that, but there's probably a lot of things you could do to simplify, just to check whether the mechanisms are correct, because it's easy to just check whether the reconstruction is correct or not. Is that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. So I mean, like, if once you've done the sweep and you can see all the different solutions that they find for each minimality coefficient, like, what goes into deciding which of those is the appropriate decomposition?
So in that case, this is a time model where we have the ground truth, but in general, we want mechanisms to be either active or not active. So like this kind of situation where you have here this intermediate shade of blue, it means that the importance allocated to the component is somewhere in between 0 and 1. It's like half active, which is definitely not good, definitely not what we want. So if the composition is correct, you should end up in a situation where everything is either 0% active or 100% active. So that is one criterion. And of course, then the other thing is whether the reconstruction and faithfulness is correct or not. Like, does your decomposition actually produce the same result as the full model.
Yeah.